I find that blowing off work is like a marvelous way for stuff to come to you because
Austin Kleon, the best-selling author of books like Steal Like an Artist, Show Your Work, and his newest one called Keep Going. I believe that Steal Like an Artist is the manifesto for creativity in the digital age. He's a wildly creative guy.
the other trick that I love is you just try to make the worst thing that you can, just the ugliest possible thing. Like, just, I'm going to make absolute junk. Success can be a very toxic thing to a creative person. There's a great Oscar Wilde line. He says, "Those whom the gods wish to punish, they answer their prayers." Just forget about what you'd like your job title to be. What do you like to do? What are the verbs? Because, like, people are always asking kids, what do you want to be when you grow up? And I never ask kids that, ever. People think they want to make a living doing what they love, but once you start making a living doing what you love, it puts a whole kind of pressure on it that you probably aren't ready for. You probably think you're ready for it, but you're not. If you feel yourself getting older and like young people are insane, like just assume that they're not insane or that there's something to what they're doing.
What do you think are some of the biggest misconceptions that young people have about being an adult?
I think the biggest misconception that young people have about adults is that they know what the fuck they're doing.
So I'm going to start off with a pretty heavy question. When it comes to creativity and like creative work, what's the role of going through struggle and hard times and all of that?
Oh, I think that's pretty much par for the course. I think that's every day.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's real simple. You just kind of show up, you know. Actually, one of my favorite writers this morning, Laura Lippman, she said, Mother Nature is a great example for a genre writer because within very tight constraints, she shows up every day and does something just a little bit different. I thought that was really beautiful.
Yeah.
It's like, you know, you show up every day within this constraint and, you know, you try to do something a little bit different. And I think that's kind of no matter what your creative practice is, I think that's kind of the very boring but real secret is you just show up.
Yeah, you something I learned about you and doing my research for this is that you like to study a lot of people that have passed away, maybe that are writers and are even people now. I feel like you do a lot of reading and stuff into that. Is there a common theme that all of these people went through struggle? Is that something that you find?
Well, I think human beings struggle, and I don't think that, you know, writers are any different. I think that, you know, or creative people in general are really that different. I think the problem is that creative people have to actually produce something. You know, like a lot of people struggle, but they go to, you know, they might have a job that has very like set parameters. You can show up and like, you know, it's very clear about what you're supposed to do. You know, I went to a doctor one time. And he said, he asked me what I did, and I said, I'm a writer. And he said, oh, that must be really cool to use your brain all day. And I looked at him, I was like, that's just what you want to hear your doctor say. And he said, oh no, he's just like, you know, and he kind of gestured around at his office, and he said, you know, I know what I'm going to be doing for the next 15 years. You know, somebody comes in sick and I fix them. He said, you have to make stuff up. And so I think that's really... You know, that's really the thing is that there's this constant, you're never done. Like, you'll never hit that cruising speed. Like, I think if you're like a world-class surgeon or something, you like figure out, well, this is how we fix people's hearts. And I do 4 of these surgeries a day or, you know, whatever, and I'm done. And, you know, even if you wrote a really good book, like, that's not going to write your next book, you know? And so that's like the kind of perpetual motion of being a creative person. And I think that's the real tension and the struggle in the creative world is just that you have to constantly like almost make your own problems and solve them over and over and over again.
So you when you released your book Keep Going, you said that you almost wanted to quit at some point, like that in that time period before you wrote the book. Why is that?
Well, I really like writing. I really like reading. I really like drawing. I like all those verbs. I don't necessarily like making books. Like books they are really difficult for me. Part of that is the machinery of the publishing industry. Like I really don't. Um, Publishers want you to know what the book is before you sell it to them. And so before you write it or before you even, go at it. And I always find that the worst part of the process. But mostly I was, before I wrote Keep Going, I was just struggling with this, something else we just talked about, which is that you're never done. Like you're really never, you never achieve perfection. Every book is a kind of like, you were aiming for a target, but you hit something else and it's fine, but it wasn't what you thought when you first, started out. And you can always see the imperfections and you can always see the failures in the work. But there's two ways to look at that. It's like, oh God, you're never done. Or it's, oh, you're never done. You just keep going, And so it's really like a mindset thing. It's like, oh, I have to write another book versus, oh, I get to write another book. That's one of my favorite, like, kind of linguistic tricks that I forget who taught me that. But, just this idea that, and ultimately that, it's a good gig to make things. Like, it's fun. Not a lot of people get to do it. And just to remember, like, how lucky and kind of blessed you are to be doing the work and to go at it, and kind of be grateful and go at the work with gratitude. I think that was the thing about like writing Keep Going was I was able to like be really grateful for the process by the end of it. And so, yeah, that book was a book I read because I needed to read it. Like I really needed that book at the time. And I like books to have that kind of urgency when I write them, like that I feel like they need to be there. If I don't have that urgency, like they're really hard to work on.
So how do we know when it's time to put the pen down or submit that book to the publishers? Because you talked about that concept of perfection and trying to get it perfect. When do we know it's that time that we just got to be like, you know what, this is the best I could do. Here you go.
When it's due. When it's due. I mean, that's why I love deadlines. That's why I work so well with deadlines. If somebody tells me, if someone came to me with a lot of cash right now and said, we need this book by Christmas, it's going to be this long and it needs to be about this, I could do it because I'm so good at working to deadlines. There's something about the gun to your back of a deadline. But if I don't have a deadline, I won't work on something. I just won't. And that's why I find it really helpful. I do this weekly newsletter, and I do a free version every Friday, and then I do a paid version every Tuesday. And so every Monday I have to come up with something that people will pay for, like something that's good enough that the people who pay for it, I feel like it's a good deal. And there's something about having that deadline every Tuesday. I always come up with something. Even if on Sunday night I don't know what it's going to be, like I have all of Monday blocked off and I'll come up with something on Monday. And so that's why I really like believe in deadlines, and whether they're, you can set artificial deadlines if you want, which is good. But I also like contractual deadlines. That to me, like telling someone on a piece of paper, a kind of binding agreement, like I'm going to turn in something to you, that lights a fire in a way that I don't really know that anything else does for me.
Yeah, urgency. I feel like urgency is important because people think they have all the time in the world until they have 5 years pass and they realize that they did nothing in that time. Another big reason why people aren't really taking action is because of procrastination. What are the things that you do to overcome procrastination? I think it's important to clarify that everyone experiences moments of procrastination, and I feel like a lot of people they kind of get mad at themselves when they go through procrastination instead of actually taking steps to fix it. So what are some stuff that you do to overcome your procrastination?
Well, I try to practice what I call productive procrastination, which is I procrastinate on the thing I'm supposed to be working on with another form of work. So if I'm supposed to be writing a book, I might like procrastinate by making a collage that later on I'll use as, in a newsletter or online or something, or I'll, read as procrastination. And that's technically part of my job. So it's kind of like finding the fun. I like finding the fun parts of your job that you need to do anyway, that you can kind of use as a procrastinatory tool, But the other thing I think is really, kind of helpful for me is to have more than one thing going at all times. And I find that, if you're working on more than one project, it's often when you get burnt out on one project, you go to the other project, work on it for a bit, and you often find the thing you needed when you were working on the project that you're supposed to be working on, while you're working on the procrastination project. So I think for me, it's just a matter of like, having some, I have a term I use called comfort work. It's work that you do that's actual work that needs done, but it's very comforting. And to have some of the stuff in your back pocket that you have to do anyway, and to have that stuff that you turn to when you feel like procrastinating. So for me, it might be, reading or making art or whatever it is. It could even be like going through like my notes or my notebooks, just rereading, that's something that I keep I'm a pretty big notebook keeper. And so a lot of times when I don't have something to write about, all I really need to do is reread myself, like kind of go back in time and look through old notebooks and stuff. And there's usually something in there that I can use. I think people don't give themselves time to do that a lot, to look back through their old work. And when I look back through my old work, I often find something that is like, oh, I haven't thought about that for a minute, or, oh my God, here's the very thing I need that I'm working on right now, or, wow, this is a real piece of crap. Like, let me improve this. Like, this is an okay gem of an idea, but like the execution wasn't very good,
Yeah. So I also know about you is that you like to almost in your free time practice like music. Do you play the piano? Is that correct?
Uh, yeah, I play a couple of different things. Music was kind of my huge passion when I was a kid. So yeah, I play the piano, I play the guitar, write songs. So yeah, music's my hobby, really. My real passionate hobby, and I've kept it a hobby because I believe really deeply in having a good old-fashioned hobby. Something that you don't try to monetize, or you don't try to leverage it for your work or anything like that. So music is like a very pure thing for me. I think artists or writers in general, really, most of the writers I know would love to be musicians. I think it's just a grass is always greener thing, because I know a lot of musicians who'd like to be writers. But to me, music is the greatest art form, and so that's what I'm like super passionate about, and so that's what I do when I really need to blow off steam.
I'm curious. So, is there any times where maybe you're going through some writer's block and then you go to music and then all of a sudden, after the fact or while you're doing it, something hits you and then you get inspired to write? Does that ever happen?
That happens. It happens in lots of different. I find that blowing off work is like a marvelous way for stuff to come to you, because we have this real grind mindset. People say, "Oh, the grind, you just gotta grind through things." But the creative mind doesn't really work like that. Like a lot of really great creative insights, you sort of have to show up. But then if it's not coming, it's kind of a good idea to kind of blow off for a bit and come back. The important thing is just that you come back. So I find that anytime I'm in a very uptight state, and lots of artists say this, when you're super uptight, that it's very hard to make things that way. And so I have a whole kind of toolkit of stuff I do that when I'm feeling that super uptight thing. If I want to stay in the studio and see if something happens, I'll do some of that procrastination work that I don't know that procrastinate is a word, but it would be a good one if it's not. I make a collage or do something real fun in here, or even clean. I find that cleaning is very relaxes me. I'll put on music real loud and clean the studio. If I need to leave the studio, I love taking walks, real meandering, chill walks around my neighborhood. I also love to bike. I got really into biking the past like year and a half. So I'll go for a ride on my bike, play music. Sometimes like taking a shower is great. Like I don't like to take a shower in the morning because I like to use a shower later as like a kind of like cleansing device. So I'll get a good idea if I do that. Take a nap, swim in the pool. Sometimes I'll do that. So I find that Carole King, one of the greatest songwriters, someone asked her what she does with writer's block. She's like, well, I show up every day, and if nothing comes after a bit, I knock off. I go do so fun things, and then I come back later and try it again. And I think that like one of the interesting things about being a creative person is that you're trying to constantly sort of validate what you do. Like people don't value creative work a lot. Like in the wider culture, it doesn't look like work. So you're always trying to make it sound like work. Like I work really hard, and you want people to value it. So you're like, but the real truth of the matter is that most of the time the really good stuff feels like play. And so I think like sometimes because we want to be taken seriously as workers and we want people to know the value of what we do, that voice starts showing up in your head that you don't do things that you need to do that will get you to the work later on. If I'm being clear, like if there's something about like, an artist wants to be seen as a worker, as someone who works hard and has value to the wider culture, but it also requires a lot of what looks like doing nothing. And my wife likes to remind me of that all the time because, she says, you work all the time is what she says. She said, I wouldn't say that you work extremely hard. It's just the work is stretched out over your whole life. Like every minute of your life, the work is kind of stretched out and you're kind of always on and you don't take breaks and you're kind of like, and so it's something that I struggle with myself, but I find the more I let myself loosen up and the better the ideas are, just to kind of stay loose and free and but to show up, you show up and you try to make something happen, but you try to stay loose with it. My kids have helped a lot with that because kids are really good at, kids will make stuff and they just won't worry about it.
Yeah.
And if it sucks, they'll go watch TV.
Yeah.
Come back later. They're just my kids are like really creative and they make a lot of stuff, but they don't worry about it too much. And so I try to emulate them when I'm like kind of flailing around.
Yeah. Something that I've heard you say is that, there's obviously days where you just don't want to write or you just don't want to do whatever creative thing it is, draw. And something I heard you say is to just write about how much you hate or how much you don't want to write right now, or even like draw like the worst drawing you could ever do. And you said that sometimes there's some brilliance that comes out of that. So explain that a little bit.
Well, I find that, when you're trying too hard, it's like one really good trick. Yeah, that's a good trick for writers is to start writing about how much you hate writing. That works. That kind of loosens you up in a bit. The other trick that I love is what you just said, which is like you just try to make the worst thing that you can, just the ugliest possible thing. Like just I'm going to make absolute junk. And most of the time it's junk, but every once in a while when you're trying really hard to make something as ugly as you can, you can't help but like try to make it like a little good. And then you get tricked into working. It's very much like you're tricking your rational mind into work, or you're trying to silence that voice that's trying to be good, and you just do stuff, And I think that's really, that's a real, we have two hemispheres in our brains. And, I don't really believe that people are left-brained or right-brained, but what I do believe is that the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere, they have different kinds of attention that they pay to the world. And the left brain tends to be like very laser-focused and logical and very like focus laser, and then the right brain is more like kind of holistic. It like finds it's very like paying attention to what goes on around you. It's kind of like when a bird's having dinner, it also has to look around for what it's about to eat it. There's this like hyper vigilance on getting food, but also this like kind of like ambient awareness of what's around you so you don't get eaten. And I feel like that's that's the creative mind. It's kind of a very good balance between the two, and it's like different modes. So like a lot of really good creative work, I think, is turning off that hyper, or giving that hyper focused mind something to do to free up the other part. So like if when I'm writing, if I pay super, super close attention to writing slowly and making the words as beautiful as I can, like the letter forms even, this is something the cartoonist Linda Berry taught me. If I concentrate on doing it really slowly and making the letter forms perfect, sometimes that frees up my brain to think ahead and to think about like, what I want to write about. And then that works. So it's really like it's so much of it is like just tricking your brain into doing what you want it to do. And a lot of that is like understanding that you're a creature, that you're not a machine. Like, Chat GPT, you can just tell it like, make this thing, do this. And no, that's not right. Do this, and you just can't do that to yourself. Like, you have to kind of like embrace your whole like kind of creatureliness when you make creative work. And you have to kind of like listen to your body and listen to different parts of your brain and like kind of put yourself in the right environment and space for it. It's very tedious. It's very difficult.
Yeah. Something I find too, it's like there are some days where I've experienced this where you're just exhausted and you're like, I don't want to, like for me, it's like, I don't want to edit videos today. I don't want to prepare for podcasts. What I find is that sometimes when I start working on it for like 10 minutes, all of a sudden I'm energized. Like once I get going a little bit. So what's the role of, I want to say momentum into like, cause I feel like there are times where you dive into something and you're super creative right away. And then there's times where you're just not feeling it. But then over time, throughout maybe when you're working on something for an hour or two, then it really kicks in. I find that happens to me a lot.
You nailed it, man. Like that's why I think it's really like, I think a lot of creative people don't like, maybe they weren't the sporty kids at school or, like I think it's really important for people who want to be creative to have some kind of physical practice, whether it's like walking or biking or working out, some kind of exercise, because like nobody wants to exercise. Like, like it's very rare that you have some people do, but I don't. And I always like, no matter what, every day, like I go out for a walk or a bike ride. And even if I'm like hungover, like the other day I was shockingly hungover and my buddies we were riding the next day. And I showed up and I rode, and honestly, it was one of the better rides because I was like, I was like, you know what? If I get through this and I don't puke, like this will be great. And and that's literally what it's, that's kind of how it is with work. It's like you just have to show up and like just go through the motion. People talk about, oh, he's just going through the motions, and actually, that's how you get into the work a lot of the times is by going through the motions. Like if you're editing video, it's like pulling up, I don't know, Final Cut or whatever, and you start clicking on stuff. For a writer, it's like you start moving the pen and you start typing. For a collage artist, you start cutting things up and pasting them. For a musician, it's like you start playing chords on the piano. It's like all this stuff. And the motion, going through the motions, that is the thing that tricks your brain into getting into it, But again, it's that full creatureliness, right? It's that muscle memory, that like using your body and getting your body to tell your mind as much as your mind tells your body. I think that's what I'm trying to say, is that a lot of creative people, they think it starts here and then here just tells this what to do, and that's not necessarily how it works. It's more of like a two-way street. It's like, it's just as often that you'll be doing something with your hands, and your hands tell your brain to do something as the other way. It's really a two-way street. Like your nervous system it's a system, it's a network. It's not like just, it's not unidirectional, you know.
Yeah, something I heard you quote. I hope I don't mess this up. I heard her. I think it's Stephen King, and he said that it's very over. I'm gonna botch this completely, but I'll get the basic point across. Is that like if you have to write a book and you write a page every day, by the 1 year you have 365 pages. So what's the role of consistency in all of this?
Well, I used to put a lot more. I think it's the most important thing, really, especially for people who are starting out. Now, I think that people who have kind of mastered their craft in a sense, I think it becomes more important to inject randomness into their systems and to be a little more inconsistent over time. But for people who are starting out and trying to get good at something, I think consistency is everything. Like showing up and doing like just if you try to make a drawing, everybody kind of knows this, but it's just hard. It's like if you show up and try to do a drawing every day, like by the end of a year, you're going to be better. I'm not going to say you're going to be great, but you're going to be better. Like during the pandemic, there were a couple of writers I knew who took up drawing and they would post their stuff online. And I just couldn't believe how good they got after a while. And that's kind of what's cool about something like Instagram or Twitter or anything like that is that that's a machine for capturing dailiness in a sense, like these little snippets. And then you can go back through in time and kind of see development. And so my friend Sam Anderson, like he started drawing like really intensely in the past 5 years, and he's gotten really good. Nicholson Baker was another writer that started drawing I think real recently, and I just couldn't believe how you could tell they were working on it every day, just how good they got. And so that's just like a little example, but it's like if you now here's the difference. Now here's something that I would say that is difficult. We're talking about craft stuff, like getting better. Ideas are a little bit slippery. They're more slippery. Like creative ideas, that's a little bit more slippery because ideas tend to come through us through experience and from taking things in, not just like showing up and doing repetitive things as much. So while you're like showing up and doing your craft and working a lot, you also have to make sure that you're being out in the world and you're seeking new experiences and stuff like that. So, yeah, it's an interesting tension. You've actually helped me. This is something I kind of want to write about soon because there's this kind of idea that you have to like, you have to show up and do the same thing over and over again to do better, but you also know that you have to be doing things differently in order to find something new. There's a term called, I don't know if it's in psychology or what, it's explore versus exploit. So, you want to exploit the things that you're good at and that while also exploring. It's kind of that laser focused left brain thing, while also that kind of right brain looking around explorative thing. And that's something that as a creative person, I'm just like very, very interested in that most creative work, it deals with these kinds of tensions that seem like you're being pulled between opposites, these kind of paradoxical situations. And it's really the tension of those things pulling at each other that creates the energy of the work. And that's why, like, when you read about a movie where they didn't have a very big budget and their main star died right away or whatever, and like the studio was going to shut them down, it created all this like tension. And like sometimes tension, like things snap, but sometimes there's like great energy, in that tension that's formed. It's kind of like a rubber band.
And this kind of when you were saying that, I thought of the conversation we had before about struggle, right? I feel like that struggle almost creates that tension in a way.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's the stuff that life is made of. And I actually think that, like, so there has to be a little bit of tension in your life to even want to make anything. And people are like, what are you talking about? I'm like, well, think about it. If you're perfectly happy with how the world is, why would you add anything to it? Why would you change it? Like, if people are like, huh? And it's like, well, to be a creative person is to be somewhat maladjusted in the sense that you feel like there needs to be something else. You know, like you look around at the world and you think, oh, well, this is pretty good, but you know what? I think we could do a little better. You
Yeah.
know, I mean, that really is the creative impulse. And I mean, that's a very human impulse, but there has to be a little bit of friction or a tension between what is and what could be. And so it's that tension between reality and imagination that I think is, you know, it's really rich, and that's where all the stuff comes from. So when you talk about struggle, there is a very basic struggle, which is here is life as I know it, and but I feel like it could be like this, right? Or life is like this and I feel like it could be like this. The gap between those two creates a little bit of a struggle. And you know, I'm always telling, I always try to remind people that to be a creative person means that you're again somewhat maladjusted because healthy people, you know, sometimes healthy people, it's like, well, this is pretty good. Is there any work to do? No. Well, I think I'll relax.
So you're a best-selling author. Obviously, you've seen a lot of success. How do you create that tension now? Because you've already reached that peak, right? And so, like, how do you create that tension nowadays?
Oh, it's a great question. I mean, it's very difficult. I'm someone who's like, I also find that like it's weird. I mean, you know, I don't know that I have a great answer. I try to remember. People think that I success can be a very toxic thing to a creative person. You know, I mean, there's lots of, you know, humans are like this though. Whenever they get what they think they want, it's often, you know, there's a great Oscar Wilde line. He says, those who those whom the gods wish to punish, they answer their prayers." You know, there's this tension in life. Is like there's kind of this. There's also the hedonic treadmill. You know, like the minute you get something, it's like you want something else. It's the give a mouse a cookie, he'll want a glass of milk kind of thing. But for me personally, I think for me, it's been about, you know, because I did this trilogy and it's done really well. And I felt very much like I said what I had to say in those books about creative work. So for me, there's a couple of things that I have to do. One, I have to make sure that I'm focusing on my own creative practice. Like I'm actually trying to make like art and poems and stuff like that, because it's very difficult when you become a person who writes about doing creative work. You become known for a person as a person who writes about creative work instead of actually doing creative work. You know, so you have to
Yeah.
make sure that you go to that source, because so many of my books were the result of me struggling to make stuff, and then the books are just the products of that process. The other thing is that you just have to fill up on good stuff, and so for me that's just like reading widely and wildly. I almost said wildly, but no, that is good. A kind of reckless, wild reading where you're going around. I find the older I'm about to turn 40, and by the time this airs, I probably will be 40. But I found that I tend to have to go back to the well. Like, what was some of that original stuff that like brought me to my work? That tends to be really restorative. So I just find myself like rereading old favorites and listening to old music, and just, you know, you're just trying to find that energy. But I'd also say that my kids too I'll mention them again. I find myself becoming what I call a curious elder. And that's someone who assumes that children are on the cutting edge and they know what they're talking about. And I find my kids, you know, kind of awaken me to all sorts of interesting things, like, you know, like the value of YouTube. Or video games, like my kids just, video games are their whole world and their whole passion. And one of the things they really love to do is they like to watch other people play video games, which if you're an old fart, that's very alarming. Like,
Yeah, yeah.
as an old person, you're very much like, oh my
Why?
God, it's
Yeah.
bad enough that they want to play video games, but they're watching other people play video games. And so I had this initial reaction, but I also have this curious elder ethos where I'm like, I assume my kids are all right. I assume the kids are all right. So I'm like, let me figure out I assume there's something to what they're into. And so I spent a day with them watching, like, I'm trying to remember one of the names of them, somebody on Twitch or somebody on some of these YouTube, gamers. And I was watching it and I was like, huh, so we're watching somebody play a game and there's commentary over top of it. I was like, oh, it's watching sports. Like, we're
Yeah, that's a
watching
good way to put it,
sports.
yeah.
Like this is like what my uncles did when they watched football. Difference is that you can watch these guys play this game and turn around and play it just like them. Because, like, it's like you can't watch like an NFL game and then be like, great, I'm going to take that move and like make it my own. But it's interesting because historically, that is how, like, someone like Kobe Bryant, he grew up with VHS tapes he was one of the first, kind of the first generation to have VHS tapes. So he could watch games of basketball and like take moves and like adapt them to his own deal. So this is just like one long-winded example of how just if you feel yourself getting older and like young people are insane, like just assume that they're not insane or that there's something to what they're doing. And I find that that's like a really good way to kind of like wake yourself up to things. Because I immediately thought, oh, well, if someone will, I haven't actually done anything with this yet, but I was like, oh, well, if someone will watch someone else play a video game, they'll probably watch them make art and talk about it. And it's like, well, duh, Bob Ross or someone like that. So, yeah, it's just like, you go back to old wells that you drilled that still give you good water, but then it's also like drilling new wells, finding new well springs constantly. And I still don't have a great, answer for how you create that tension. It kind of has to be artificial tension. It has to be like there just has to be some little thing that you haven't done yet. You're like, okay, well, this time, I feel like film directors are really good at this. They'll be like, well, this time I want to experiment with like artificial lighting or something. It can be like a technical thing, right? Like, well, here's this tool I've never used before. Let's try it. Let's try a digital camera this time instead of film, or something like that. So for me, for my next book, I learned InDesign, which is the program that people use to lay out books. I learned that when I was working on the 30th anniversary edition of Steal Like an Artist, because I wanted to lay out they had 16 pages to fill, and I was like, well, let me just do it. Let me just like do it in InDesign. I'll do the whole thing. I'll teach myself, how to do it. And after I did that, I thought, oh, I'm going to do a whole book like this next. And so just like giving yourself like just like one little challenge. You don't have to make a completely different book, but maybe you use like a different tool, or maybe you use like a different subject, just like tweaking it a little bit. That, I think that creates like just enough tension to get there. So maybe I can actually pull that off.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah. Something I've heard you say is if you want to be a noun, do the verb. So, I could put it in other ways, like if you want to be a podcaster, do podcasts. If you want to be a writer, write. So what does that quote mean to you? If you want to be a noun, do the verb.
Well, I just know a lot of people that would really like to be a writer, but writing is really difficult. Like, I'd really like to be known as a writer, but I don't know that I want to sit down and write. And a lot of people, my advice is really, Cormac McCarthy just died. And that was a guy that, like, was known as a writer, like, very important writer. But he's also a dude that, like, it's all that he wanted to do. Like, for him, he would be in interviews and he'd be like, I don't want to be in this interview. I'd rather be writing. Like, a good day to me is like a blank sheet of paper and an empty calendar. And so a lot of times with people, I always like, especially young people, I'm like, just forget about what you'd like your job title to be. What do you like to do? What are the verbs? Because like people are always asking kids, what do you want to be when you grow up? And I never ask kids that ever. Because every kid just wants to be a YouTuber now. No, no. I ask kids, what are you into? What do you like to do? And you get so much, much more interesting answers. And I always felt like my job didn't, whatever it is that I do, it didn't exist when I was a kid. And I don't assume that in the future, there will be some new thing that everyone does. So I don't think nouns are very helpful when you're planning on the future, because who knows whether the nouns will be the same. What I tell people is to focus on your verbs. What do you like to do? And for me, it's like, well, I love to read, and I love to monkey around with websites, and I love to write, and I love to make art, and I love thinking about what other art forms have to say to other art forms. I love reading about so eventually it's like, well, if I just concentrate on that stuff, something emerges out of that, rather than being like, I want to be a, this, and it's much easier if there's a predetermined, career. Like, if you want to be a nurse, there's a clear path to doing that, and that's good work, and that's solid work, and that's like a good thing. But like, there was no map for me getting to where I am now, and I don't think there's really a map for me getting to where I will be in 20 years. It's just this like constant, exploring and paying attention to what it is that I really like to do. And I assume that if you focus on the verb, that will take you further than like focusing on the noun.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of young people are way too focused on on what the actual job is, or like the job title.
Yes.
Rather, like, I want to be an astronaut, I want to be this, without actually saying, like, asking themselves the question, like, do I actually like this? I mean, I can think of, I went through this same exact thing. When I was in my freshman year of college, my dream was to be the athletic trainer of the Boston Celtics. But then I realized that, like, wait a second, I actually, like, don't care about the human body. Like, I really just don't care. And so that's not going to work. And
Right.
so I was like, all right, so what do I do care about? It was psychology. It was almost what I'm doing now with this podcast. But so that's why I ended up switching my major to, was psychology. And so I think it's, especially when you're in that school mode, like just learning and learning and learning, you're not actually doing the things. Like, we tend to romanticize maybe these jobs that we realize that were not for us, which is maybe why a lot of people go through quarter life crises and those job changes.
And I would say it's also kind of the fault of school. Like, school is structured to push you into a track. I mean, like, you're supposed to pick a major, and you're supposed to, have a aim in mind. School has become way more professionalized than what it, if you kind of look at the history of like college or something like that, colleges did not used to be so professionalized. You were going there to get a more broad education. I was really lucky. I mean, I wasn't exactly getting great jobs when I got out of school, but I went to this interdisciplinary school within a bigger state school. And the whole idea was that you didn't really choose a major. You choose something that you really wanted to focus on, or you took two different things and like smashed them together. So I was kind of like really lucky to fall into this formal education system that I was able to do the things that kind of like came naturally to me in that way. And the whole ethos of that kind of interdisciplinary program was that you would kind of create your own job by taking these like interesting passions and kind of mashing them up and becoming an expert in some weird niche or, something like that. And, so I kind of got lucky that way, but I do feel that school, that's really challenging. You also end up with a lot of people that are soaked in education debt, and they do exactly what you're talking about. Well, I got my law degree, and then I started practicing law and realized I hate it. I want to be an athletic trainer, you know,
Yeah.
and then you've. I used to work for a law school, and I updated the financial aid website every year, and it's like, you know, what, you're going into massive debt for that. So the education system, I think, is something that I'm someone who loves teachers. I just really kind of despise school. I really think that school in almost every form is kind of like broken in a weird way. But it's a tricky dance because I love teachers and I kind of despise everything about school.
I completely agree. So coming kind of related to this topic, let's say someone watching this right now, they have a passion that they want to do. Maybe they want to be a writer. Maybe they want to be on social media. Maybe they have this certain passion that they have, but they have to pay the bills, right? And they have a job on the side. What would your advice be to that person? Maybe they want to make that switch to doing the creative thing full time. What would your advice be to them?
My advice would be to keep your day job.
Hmm.
Because I actually really enjoyed my years where I had a really steady day job. Now, they're harder to come by these days just because of the economy and just the way things go. But if you have a good, steady day job, what that kind of does is that people think they want to make a living doing what they love, but once you start making a living doing what you love, it kind of like it puts a whole kind of pressure on it that you probably aren't ready for. You probably think you're ready for it, but you're not. And so one of the things I would try to do is to try to figure out whether you can start doing the kind of work that you want to do while your funding comes from somewhere else. Like you think about your day job as a funding source and it funds the kind of the funds fund the fun,
Mhm.
in a sense. The other thing I would tell people is to really be a fan first. So, for example, if you want to be a writer, one really great way to become a writer is to become a really great reader and to be a public reader. Um, I know a lot of people who sort of got their start with their kind of professional career by just being someone in the world that was interested in this thing. So you take someone like me, for example. When I first got started, I didn't really have work that was good enough to share with the world yet, but I did feel like I had some taste. And so that's where I started from with my blog. I assumed that, I could kind of be public with my taste and kind of connect with people through that before I had the work to actually give them. Ira Glass has this thing that everybody's seen by now, and he says, when you first start out, it's like your skill is down here, but your taste is up here. And you have to just like make a bunch of stuff until you kind of like, it's one of those tensions we were talking about, earlier. But what I always say is like, oh, if your taste's up here and your skills are down here, why don't you share this stuff? Why don't you share your good tastes while you're getting good at the thing that you're really trying to
Mm.
do? So I'm always like, hey, if you want to be a writer, one of the first things, I have a friend who wants to make movies and does make movies. One of the things that I thought he did that was brilliant is he started a blog, and this was like 10 years ago or something. He started a blog that was about, he just made his way through the 100 best screenplays list, like AFI's 100 greatest screenplays, and wrote about them. And I told him, I was like, man, this is such a great way to kind of get into things, because by being a fan, by paying this kind of attention, you attract the attention of people who are into that world, And I still think there are people who come to me not through my books necessarily, but they come because they heard the newsletter is really good and it's free, and like, so they start reading my like weekly newsletter and they're like, wow, this is like interesting stuff, or that isn't, and they stop following, whatever. But eventually I'll get them to buy a book or to be interested in like a piece I made because they're there for the other show. but like eventually I get them with like some of my own stuff, you know. So that's my advice, is just to join the world you want to be in right away. And I think that's easier in some fields than others. Like, you know, even if you wanted to make movies, to become like an usher at a theater first, and just, you know, like when I was starting out, I got a job in a library, and that was a huge education for someone to be a writer who wanted to be a writer, because all of a sudden it was like, oh, you mean people aren't constantly, you know, checking out these little artsy fartsy novels that I like to read? They want like Danielle Steele and Stephen King on the whole, or like self-help books, or like whatever, you know. I mean, just that, like, just that real clear-eyed, you know, perspective that, hey, guess what? Like, some of the things that you do might not be the most commercial things. This idea that, you know, there, in the end, you are trying to reach readers. I mean, you know, just that little bit was enough for me to say, okay, am I going to be all right doing this stuff and having a smaller readership, or do I want to try to do something a little bit more ambitious? I have always, you know, one of the primary tensions in my work is I work in this very popular format, the illustrated self-help book. But I try to make them as weird as I can while still being commercial. So, you know, I'm constantly trying to sneak in like my more artsy, kind of weirder, darker stuff into this like kind of enthusiastic, you know, commercial format. And that's always it's like a musician. It's like Nirvana. I mean, you know, there's three complete weirdos, but they write pop songs. Their pop songs are just really weird, you know. That always really appealed to me. That was my era. Or something like Green Day, you know. It's like Green Day writes pop music. They just happen to do it with really loud, punky guitars and that kind of style. So I think I was kind of raised on that kind of idea that you could do popular things with a kind of weirdness to it. Whether that's, you know, so that's kind of like my game with my work.
This next question, I got really excited when I came up with this question. I'm excited to hear your response to this. What do you think are some of the biggest misconceptions that young people have about being an adult?
Oh, wow. I think the biggest misconception that young people have about adults is that they know what the fuck they're doing. I don't know if we're allowed to swear on here.
No, you
but,
are. Trust me.
I think that I have a friend named Clayton Cubitt, and he's a photographer, and like he's constantly telling people like, "Hey, teenagers, you know that thing that you suspect that everyone like is just winging it and like they don't really know what they're up to?" He's like, "That's real, and you can use it to your advantage." You know, because adults really don't know what they're doing anymore. I mean, I think that's one of the things about becoming middle-aged is like you realize like, I just got here, man. Like Kurt Vonnegut would say that to his kids. His kids would like be railing at him about like the state of the world. Dad, why don't you, you know, this is, everything's bad. And he would say, shut up. I just got here myself, you know? And so I think that's one of like the really big misconceptions. I also think that like that said, that it's always worth like listening to old people, you know, because they've been, you know, just because they've done it, they've been through stuff. And so it is that tension of, again, another tension of like, old people have experience, but they're also just beginners because we just don't live long enough to be anything other than like an amateur, you know, like we don't get enough time, I don't think, to ever really become experts. Certainly not in life, because life changes so much constantly that nobody's really an expert at life, you know, because the minute you've got one thing figured out, it's like, oh no, like this thing changed. And so yeah, I think that's the biggest misconception is like, one, that adults have it figured out, but also but yeah, that tension again, that there's value in experience, but also knowing that everyone's like kind of perpetually winging it, kind of indefinitely. And certainly more the way the world changes. I mean, I made a poem the other day and it said something like where, the future arrives and all the teachers become students or something like that, or all experts become students, just because like things change and the world changes. And, I've made a couple of poems like that. One was like, the minute I learned the rules did not apply to me.
Hmm.
That
Yeah.
kind of thing. But no, I think for young people in particular, I would say you have no idea the amount that people are winging it. And so if you have any kind of imposter syndrome, or you're worried about doing it wrong or being wrong or anything, you really have to lean into just winging it and going for it, because that's what everyone else who does anything is doing.
Speaking of winging it, what would you say are some of the biggest regrets that you have from your 20s?
Oh, from my 20s? It's hard because like I probably would have partied more.
Really?
And then no one ever says
Hmm.
that. I got married when I was really young. I was 23 when we got married, everyone said it was young at the time. Doesn't feel like that. I don't necessarily regret it though, because it's like now I can, now I really love my life. I probably would have like, I think it's just, the problem is it's all like, it's just all, the older you get, the cliches become true and you just hate it because you're like, ugh, all that cliched stuff they told, like travel at every opportunity, that kind of thing. Oh, I wish I'd traveled more. I think the main thing is though, uh, one of my favorite writers, George Saunders, says all of my biggest regrets have been failures of kindness. He said when I failed to be kind to other people, those are the things I regret most in life. And I think kindness is something very underrated, especially for someone in their 20s. And so I think the more you can be kinder to people, the happier you'll be, later on. So maybe I'd say that. Be kind. Yeah, kindness. I regret that. And just, taking every opportunity. If someone wants to go, do it,
Yeah.
within
Yeah.
reason.
Yeah. There's.
I do not regret not trying heroin. That was always a good thing. Nothing you
Yeah.
shoot
Yeah.
or snort.
Yeah.
I never, like staying off of hard drugs, I felt like that was a really, really good choice. And I'm glad I made that
Definitely.
choice.
Yeah, one of my least favorite advices that I see out there when it comes to young people is that like you should lock yourself in your room and just work. And I'm like, yeah, I mean, like obviously it sucks not to reach your potential, but in my opinion, it sucks even more to not live your life and spend your entire 20s or your young life in your room working on something when you could have been out having experiences. And I could argue that those experiences are as valuable as sitting in your room and just working all day.
I mean, yeah. And it's funny how much like people are, writers in particular, are pressured to publish so early. And I'm reading Don Quixote right now, which sounds really highfalutin, but it's not really. It's just this crazy 400-year-old book written by a guy who's like 50. He's like not very old, or he's older. He's Cervantes had this whole like one act, and then he became a writer, and he's kind of poor, and but like someone like even Herman Melville, who wrote Moby Dick when he was like 30, he'd never read Shakespeare at 30. Like, so he read Shakespeare and then he was like, well, this guy's crazy. I want to kind of write like him. And then he gets Moby Dick, I mean, like this idea that, but these guys had experiences, they had real, like Cervantes was a soldier, Melville sailed, all that stuff. But yeah, experience is what life is really made out of. And I think people are always asking me how to get things done. And the question, getting things done isn't that difficult. Finding things worth doing is much more difficult. And I would say that your 20s should be about that, is to look around and find things worth doing. But if you know what you want to do, on the other hand, there's nothing wrong with going at it, going for it. So yeah.
But if you hang out with your friends on the weekend, like, you're gonna be okay. I think
Yes,
that's a big thing. Like, yes, you can work hard, but you can go out every once in a while. Like, you'll be fine.
I don't
Like, you'll
think
be okay.
anyone on their deathbed says, "Gosh, I wish I had spent less time with those people I loved and who
Yeah,
loved me."
exactly.
I
Yeah.
mean, I don't think that happens. And I think friendship is something that this world sorely lacks. And I think that we really have a crisis of, particularly men. I worry about men a lot. Having good, solid male friendships that are kind of nurturing and cool. That's a really important thing. And I think that's why guys golf. Like, my
Yeah.
dad used to golf all the time and be like, why in the hell would you spend 4 hours outside with a bunch of other losers hitting some golf ball around? And then I realized when I got older, it's like, oh, it's the fellowship. It's just like
Yeah.
being around other guys. And so, like, I tell people, especially people who are like my age, it's like you need to get like a really dumb hobby that's social. So, like, I don't really like to golf, but I love to ride bikes, and it's kind of the same thing. You go out for 2 or 3 hours with a bunch of other dudes and end up having beers after. It's like a really important thing. And I think, like, fellowship, interaction with your fellow human beings. I mean, that's really what it's about. And I think people are going to need that even more, as the world becomes more digital and artificial and, all that stuff. It will always be people that make your life worth it. Yeah.
My last question for you is, if you had a minute with your younger self, what would you tell him?
Buy Apple stock. Take all your money and here's the sports almanac from the
Yeah,
machine. No, just be nice. Don't be such a brat. Like, just be kinder to people. You don't know everything. My dad was really good at that. Like, I mean, my mom told me I could do anything, and my dad said, no one will ever care how smart you are. It'll be like, and so this is like another really good tension, is this kind of like, you can do anything. Okay, prove it. Like, so, my dad was always really good at that. He was like, no one's ever going to care how smart you are. It's going to be like how you treat them. And I think that was like really good advice. Maybe I'd just say, your parents kind of know what they're talking about. Maybe no, but I just think, like, just be kinder. Don't just be a jerk, and just be nicer to people. I don't think that fails.